Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on learning trajectories for science, technology, and engineering. I'm Ching Lim, and I'm the co-director of the STEM Innovation for Inclusion in Early Education, otherwise known as STEMIE. And I'm joined here by my colleague and co-director, Megan Vin. And we are both at the FPG Child Development Institute, but we have partners at the University of Denver as well. So this session will share how we use multiple sources of evidence to develop a set of learning trajectories for early science, technology, and engineering for children with and without disabilities, birth to 5. And we'll talk, Megan will talk more about how we use these sources of evidence and how we conducted rapid cycles of testing by observing children to understand their thinking and learning within inclusive early childhood environments. So just a quick note here that the contents of this presentation were developed by us for this conference. However, the content do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So what you see here is STEMIE's vision for the future. And we hope that, in the by the end of our project, we'll have a set of STEM learning trajectories that are validated through rapid cycles of testing within incubators and by STEM and inclusion experts. We also have a set of open source free e-learning and resources that are socially validated, high quality, useful, and relevant for practitioners and faculty to build their confidence as well as competence in supporting STEM experiences for young children, especially those with disabilities. And lastly, we'll have identified supports for practitioners as well as families to implement the learning trajectories to ensure young children with disabilities are provided effective opportunities to participate in STEM learning. So first, I would just like to start with, why are we focusing on learning trajectories? And you see here is a quote from one of our leadership members, Dr. Doug Clemens at University of Denver. And it says any good teacher and actually any good adult or caregiver who's working with the child starts with where the child is. Then the obvious question is, how do you identify where a child is going? You have to have an idea of the path, the road, or trajectory through which children develop these math or STEM skills. So let's take a look at the next slide, why it's important to start with children's thinking. So we believe that children's thinking follows a path or developmental progression. So all kids follow the same path. Some just start in a different place. And you have to know where they are so that then you can help support and scaffold their learning and moving along the path to the next level of thinking and learning. So we want to build them up from where they start. And so we call this the learning trajectories approach. So it's important to also understand where the child is on the path. So when we observe children very carefully as they engage and explore the environment and the materials they come into contact with, we can get clues to what they might be thinking. Children can give us signs and signals. Really pay attention to what they say, do, communicate in all different ways to help us figure out what they might be thinking. Even very young babies, they can show interest when things change. So if you wear that lens that help you figure out where kids' thinking is, what you can do is then to meet them where they are, wherever that may be, and then that can then, you can use it to guide what is to come next. So this is a very strengths-based based approach, when we start figuring out how the child is thinking, it reminds us of what the child can do, and really to have those very high expectations, which we know is really critical, especially for our kids with young children who have disabilities. So, oh, look, he can do X, Y, and Z, and he's on his way to subitizing. He's almost there. So noticing how children are thinking is actually more helpful than knowing if they can get the right answers or not. So here you have a quote from the recent publication from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And it really, I think, summarizes what I've been talking about here about learning trajectories. That is so important that when teachers, or if you think about other adults and families as well, are able to elicit, notice, value, and build on the many ideas, experiences, and communicative resources that children bring to the classroom, they can organize connections between children's existing knowledge and curiosity and the environment around them, supporting children to continue to make sense of the natural and the design world. So in other words, adults, you are really very, very powerful. So let's just dive in for a moment to talk about, what are learning trajectories. So as I talked about earlier, it's really to help you understand where a child is in order to help us propel that child forward on this path. So every learning trajectory consists of a goal, progression, as well as what we call teaching. So it's important to have a goal because you want to be able to support and scaffold the kids' learning to get them to the next stage of the development. So it's important to think about where the kid is right now and how can I scaffold the learning so that they get to the next stage. So understanding that current level and then changing the environment or providing the materials and guidance and scaffolding to help them get there. At STEMIE, we use a three-part approach to inclusion. We use adaptations and teaching practices to ensure that young children with disabilities can fully participate and engage in STEM. And the goal of adaptations is to remove barriers to opportunities and to ensure that children can engage in learning experiences independently. So we will first always consider the environment first. For example, like setting up the room, positioning of the child so that they can reach the materials and how the activity is done. And after that, we can then think about the materials. Are any of the toys, do they need modifications? Maybe there might be materials that require modifications so that the child could access and participate fully alongside with their peers. And assistive technology devices are also materials that can support children. And finally, of course, we consider the instruction or the guidance that adults can offer. For example, adding information, reducing the steps, or narrating the child's engagement. So what you see here is how the inclusion framework actually fits within the learning trajectory. I'm just going to be passing it over now to Megan.
Thanks, Ching. I'm really excited and I really appreciate, Ching, that you set up the why and the what they are. And now I'm going to talk about how we're developing them. And we're still in the process of developing them. So I hope that you know that this is not necessarily complete, but we're going to share where we are currently. Like Ching said, as we were thinking about, we are looking at how we ensure all of the learning trajectories, all of the pieces. So, the developmental progressions, the goals, and then also those instructional supports are sort of have information that's going to help us to develop those. Some of the things that we've used is we're using multiple sources of information. We started with a scoping review, which I'll mention again in a little bit in a minute to give you some more information. We looked at We also have added more literature reviews to this as we've been going on, because a lot happens in 4 years. So, well, hopefully there's a lot of research that happens. So we've added as new things have come up. We've also had expert reviews, people who are STEM content leaders in this area who've looked at these. We've also done some Delphi reviews, which I'm also going to talk about in a bit. But I think it's important to share that we've separated this information into 3 buckets. We have sort of these child level processes, right? Or what are those, some of the, maybe those, what are those, some of those developmental processes at the child level, such as observing, questioning, describing, exploring. We also have cross-cutting concepts with age ranges that are sort of, you know, we recognize that age ranges may or may not always be true based on your development, but we have looked at this where we've looked at these cross-cutting concepts that apply generally to all domains, such as structure and function or cause and effect and other things like that. We also have domain-specific content, right, which looks at information that has been sort of gathered within different domains. And then we've also looked at information about age range, emergence, and duration of the items in those 3 buckets. And have gathered sources relevant to each finding. It was really important for us to track what we were finding and where it came from so that we could keep track of that and hopefully share that back with other folks. So like I said, I am gonna start with the scoping review. So we really wanted to see what is out there, right? We looked at, we did an initial review of 102 sources, and we used 20 search terms to really try to identify unique references. And what we found was we had 1,407 unique references, which were articles, white papers, etc. And these sources that we looked at included database, direct searches of journals, reports, conference proceedings, and so on and so forth. And so I'm sure you can see how time-consuming this process must have been to really try to see the scope of what's out there. We used a double rater exclusion criteria for age and topic and narrowed it down to 486 references, which met our criteria. And then, like I said, we kept continuing to add to make sure. So that started in 2019. And then we continued this into, as we've been continuing on, and we found 101 more references that we reviewed. And from there, we had 43 references that we have looked at. Even with these new publications, it's really clear that there's still a gap in references related to infants and toddlers, particularly. We found very limited information on STEM for infants and toddlers. And we found very limited information for young children with disabilities in STEM as well. In fact, actually, sometimes we're excluding children with disabilities from these articles because they don't meet they're too small of an N. Also, it's important to note that we, like I said, continue to follow up. We're going to continue to keep adding to this and really continue to keep looking at the literature and then having that expert review, because I think we recognize that the research and literature is limited. And so we're going to continue to use this process where we get expert review from both inclusion and STEM experts as well to see how children are doing these processes, development, etc. The other thing we did was and we're currently still doing, was we did a review of all of the state's early learning guidelines, right? We wanted to review the goals that were in early learning guidelines across states to really understand how do states address and organize science, technology, and engineering. As a note, math was previously accomplished, so it wasn't part of this review. So we looked at science, technology, and engineering. And use the math one to help us with that as well. We wanted to look at ages addressed, areas of children's learning, emphasis, and categorization. And so we reviewed a total of 52 guidelines, and that included also, just as a note, all 50 states, District of Columbia, and the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework. And within the 52 guidelines, that consisted of about 30,388 indicators that we reviewed. Our first review, and Chih-Ing, I can never remember, that was our breadth review, right? We just wanted to see what was out there. And then now we're currently looking at a depth review to see what is the quality of that content, right? And I think what we found as we were doing this was that a lot of what we're doing, or what we're calling, well, one, there was more science indicators than there were engineering and technology. That was limited in all of these. But what I think is a really important finding was that people are not necessarily calling what they're doing early STEM. So STEM content was usually included in a cognition domain if they were included at all. So there was limited inclusion of STEM indicators. And so I think it's important for us to dig deeper, and that's why we're going in and doing this depth review as well. The other thing we did was we've done a Delphi process. So even Ching, as I'm saying all this, it feels like we've been really busy, right? Maybe that's why we feel busy, is because we have been. But, we also used a Delphi approach where we really wanted to seek a wide range of perspectives and expertise. That was one of the things that we recognized maybe wasn't available in the literature and from the ELGs, was what are the goals and developmental progressions for science, technology, and engineering. So we looked to a group of experts to really understand, to really try as a starting point for developmental progressions. Based on the fact, like I said, that there was scant research and evidence around particularly engineering and technology for this age range, and that there was very limited information on infants and toddlers. So we tried to identify another approach. A Delphi approach was deemed a research-based methodology that was an appropriate way for understanding practice-based evidence and expert opinion. And so we worked with 29 early STEM learning experts to complete a round one review of sort of a Delphi. Then we had 7 folks who completed a round 2 and 8 completed a round 3. And so I think within that, that these open-ended round 1 survey was deployed, like I said, in 2019. And then we found that those, that this informed the very initial first draft of our progressions, of the developmental progressions piece of the learning trajectories process. And so after an iterative process, we revised the route progressions, and then we continued to send back. And so, like we said, we did round 2 and then round 3 to really understand, review those comments, and then also to understand any agreements and disagreements to further refine, again, the goal areas and the developmental progressions. Then, once we did that, we also developed a very sort of initial, maybe not initial, I guess at that point, it had gone through a few rounds of updates, but then we had this expert reviewer work group who really dug deep, looked at the goals and progressions to really dig into this. And so you can see some of the folks that were helping us with that and who continue to help us with that, because again, like we said, we're continuing to test these things. So here's the current status, right? And then I'm going to tell you the fun stuff about how we're in programs trying it out. So we have identified 40 overarching goal areas, right? Those overarching goals. And then within that, all of those overarching goals have progressions, right? So we have 14 child level processes within those goals, 6 cross-cutting concepts. There are 8 for science, 5 for engineering, and 7 for technology. And like I said, some goal areas have as many as 20 progression steps. So, and really we're continuing to refine that as we're learning more, as we're observing how kids are, as we're observing children in programs. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. There are developmental progressions for each goal area, birth to age 5. And currently we're continuing to refine those progressions and make new hypotheses based on what we're seeing from kids. And so this, I think, has been really exciting work for us. And we're continuing to do that field validation and regular expert review. We are working on a web-based version of this, so that can be accessed, or will eventually be able to be accessed from our center website. And really, we're trying to make sure that we do that process also in a way that includes instructional designers, content experts, and web specialists, so that this information is really usable, easy to use for practitioners and families, and as something that people want to, a place people want to come to really try to ensure that they're thinking about how they do STEM teaching and learning for young kids, especially those with disabilities. We are currently in incubator sites. And so one of the things that we're doing is really the goal of the incubator work is to field test all the parts of the learning trajectories and to really co-create materials with practitioners. So I've talked a lot about the developmental progressions and the goal areas, but this is also a way for us to hopefully develop instructional supports or ways to figure out how to embed STEM within play or other things that people are currently already doing to ensure that the whole learning trajectories approach is really usable for all practitioners. And so, but we're also in incubators to try out things and then to observe how children are working through the activities, instruction, the problems, to really understand how those developmental progressions look so that people have as much information as possible to know what they're looking for. The rapid cycle field testing, it includes its modeling implementation on the investigations and teaching strategies. We're also doing that with children. We're working with children to try some things out, and it's really rapid, so it's happening quickly. We're also providing PD and coaching to practitioners around implementing the investigations and teaching strategies. And like I said, observing learning and development. Also during this place, we are making changes rapidly. So you'll see what we had originally is pretty different from where we are now. And so then we're continuing to engage in that cycle again. So we're sort of planning, we're trying it out, we're observing and studying it, then we're making changes, and then we're doing it all again. And so we really are excited about this work because it's critical, because it allows us to co-create with practitioners and families to really generate practice-informed evidence so that hopefully it will be used. We have multiple sites. We are also in center-based and early intervention programs. I think it's really important to note that we are in centers and we're looking at birth to 5-year-olds in centers. And then we're also in early intervention programs where people are going into homes and doing and coaching families to provide services. And so that is, we think it's really important that we focus on both what's happening, how do we support families in early intervention services, and then how do we look at centers. It's probably no surprise that the COVID-19 pandemic impacted this incubator work. And really, we had to be pretty agile and flexible when working with incubators, because as you know, many programs closed during the pandemic. And we have faced these unprecedented workforce shortage and burnout. And so those challenges with program closures or changes in state and local protocols and guidance also saw us shifting and pivoting constantly. And so one of the things we did was we purchased some iPads and swivels to really support virtual observations. We spent a lot of time really building relationships. That was one of the things that was maybe nice, was it allowed us more time to work with practitioners to build those relationships before we got into programs, and also allowed us to think about virtual visits as well. But at this point, we are at a point where all the programs have allowed us to come in and observe in person and to work with children. So that was one of the things that shifted. We originally were going to be doing more coaching of practitioners. That will come later. Right now, we have been working with children to try out the investigation to reduce the burden on practitioners, but also so that we can gather that observational data that's going to be critical for this work. For these developmental progressions. As you can see, we're working with 6 nonprofit inclusive childcare centers in North Carolina and Colorado. And then we're working with 10 practitioners representing a range of disciplines across a variety of early intervention agencies in Philadelphia. And that we have about 2 to 3 families per practitioner that we're also getting some videos so that we can do some observations. And the hope is that with these observations we're doing in the videos, that these will also serve as ways that we can share with the field. How does this look and how can this be done in different programs, in different settings with children? I think it's important that we're also talking about how we collaborate with families. So we've been working on early intervention incubators, that we have some pieces where we're talking about the cycle really is slightly different. It's sort of expanded the PDSA cycle, but you'll see the whole house is meant for us to collaborate with families, right? We're supposed to be supporting practitioners to coach families. And that means identifying children's interests, planning, expanding STEM learning opportunities, making modifications and adaptations, and really connecting what you're doing to the reason for the visit. What are a child's IFSP goals? What are you working on? And then how do you individualize? And then how do you get supportive feedback? And so we're really trying to use this as a way for us to incorporate the STEM activities for families, is to think about what are you already working on? What are the child's interests? And how can we fit the STEM into that as well? But let's get into some of the things we've learned. And we'll do this quickly, but there's been a few things that we've learned. And I'm going to show a quick video because this one is critical. We want you to watch. There's going to be a young girl that comes in wearing pink bell bottoms. And we want you to just think about, what do you notice? What do you see her doing? Think about that children's thinking piece, right? How is she interacting with these magnets? What are you seeing? To think about that developmental progressions and goal piece. So this is really important. And Chih-Ing, please feel, and I should have probably said there was no sound, so it wasn't your computer. I should have said that before we started the video, because we wanted you to focus on her. And one of the things that comes up for us, or as we've been doing this work, is how often sometimes we miss children's cues and maybe don't always capitalize on what we see them doing, right? And I think the reason we do this, and chime in, is what we love about this is you can see clearly her thinking, right? She takes the magnets, she puts them in front of, well, first she licks it, then she puts it in front of her, but then she does something really interesting where she takes it and puts it to her head. The magnets don't stick to her head, looks at them, puts them to her knees. They don't stick to our knees, but they stick together. And so I think it's really important for us to think, one of the, to really think about and to focus on how can we support practitioners and families and others with noticing what children can do, like Chih-Ing said in the beginning. And that it's important that we understand different ways children can demonstrate their understanding of concepts, demonstrate that they noticed or are experimenting, and for them to know how to provide adaptations and specialized instruction to support that independence and engagement. And there's so much that happens within that exploration, right? How do we make sure we're giving kids ample opportunity to explore? But the other piece that we think is critical is we also need to help folks to confront their biases and attitudes, right? And to have high expectations for children with disabilities, particularly those who have more significant disabilities or maybe non-speaking, and that these children are just as curious and working to make sense of the world around them. So it's really critical that we confront our biases and attitudes to really make sure that we're holding kids to high expectations and that we're recognizing what kids can do and capitalizing on it. Chih-Ing, did I miss anything as we watched this video?
No, absolutely not. Right on point.
Thanks, Chih-Ing. So the other thing that we've learned as we've been refining the progressions. So one of the things is we've been working on refining our progressions on force and motion is one of the places. And I think you'll see we've learned that, like, for example, some problems that we noticed while testing was that maybe noticing something came before manipulating. So we switched some of the words and really tried to focus more on how are kids noticing and how do we ensure that people have multiple ways of seeing how a child's noticing. And then we added some language, for example, about exerting force to create motion rather than language that implies intention to learn, but really tried to be more concrete, right, around what this would be. So for example, we changed this manipulates objects to learn how they move to exerts force on objects to create motion. And then we said, here are some examples of what this may look like. So hopefully you can see throughout this process that our point is we have some broad progressions right now and goal areas that we're really trying to get concrete to say, this could be what it might look like, but it might look different in multiple ways. And one of the things that we really found as we were doing this work was that words matter. And we found that like within our early learning guidelines or other places that many terms might already be exclusionary. Thinking about how many times we say things about looking versus really thinking about how can a child showcase this in using different senses or multiple ways of learning. And so it's really important that we really think about that. And so some of the things that we have been observing in incubators is also the multiple ways children with a diverse range of disabilities may be demonstrating their development or learning, right? For example, noticing, like we've said, could be demonstrated not just by using vision or sight, but also reaching out to touch or to feel, or maybe you're turning your head to listen, or you're tasting something, or you're licking something, or you're putting it to your head like we just saw, right? So there's all of these ways that children showcase this. And I think it's important, and I say we collectively, because we're all in this, that sometimes we miss it. And so it's really important that we think through that and that we try to find ways to make sure that it's really observable, and also that we're giving multiple ways for people to see it. So before we leave you today, Chih-Ing and I had a quick video that we wanted to share. This is going to illustrate that developmental progression that we just talked about related to force and motion. And it also is going to show some ways, that you might use some type of instruction to support a child in understanding force and motion. So it sort of shows a learning trajectory in action. I'm going to start it.
Meet Kingston. Kingston is a 3-year-old boy who lives with his mom, dad, and older sister. When Kingston was 20 months old, his parents noticed a delay in communication and had him evaluated with the local early intervention program. Kingston's communication delay was confirmed, and he received speech-language therapy and made significant progress in communication. His parents and teachers want to encourage Kingston to develop persistence, problem-solving skills, and more complex language and vocabulary. Kingston's parents decided to use his love of ramps to investigate the concepts of force and motion to help develop his problem-solving and communication skills. They also used adaptations to support his play and engagement. Note the progression Kingston and his mom work on as part of the learning trajectories in forces and motion.
What is not rolling? Oh, you have to push it. How can we make it roll without pushing? Okay, let's see how fast. Whoa, that was really fast.
Very fast.
How can we make it go slower?
Slower.
What should we do to make
Kingston's
it go slower?
mom continues to scaffold and guide different ways of setting up ramps.
This one, it'll make it very slow.
This one will make it very slow?
Yeah, because you have to do it slow.
This. Oh, a little bit slower.
Yeah, they're a bit slower.
Do you think this cow will fit down the ramp? Will it roll?
Maybe not.
Why?
Let's see. Oh.
It doesn't roll.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because it can't, but it don't have a roll things like this.
Oh, it's not round like the ball?
Yeah, it has red sides and it has blue sides.
Kingston then expands his understanding of the motion of objects. Cows don't roll because they aren't round, but balls do because they are round, like wheels.
So that is just an example of some of the things that, some of the things we're trying to develop to really support people in seeing the trajectory, seeing how children are thinking about things, and then also ways that we can promote and really intentionally support learning, right? And I think you can see that that would be something that you could do in a program, again, at home, like this mom did, but also thinking about maybe how this isn't a free play type of thing, and what is the language that maybe I use to really support a child to intentionally making some of those connections like this mom did. But we really can't thank you enough for being with us today. And so if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out and contact me or Chih-Ing, but I think you have my email on the screen. So thanks so much. And we really appreciate it and cannot wait to continue to engage with you on this content.